Poverty, the Chronic Lacking of, by Kaden and Gibson Ward.
Poverty is the lack of material resources that are necessary to live a decent, dignified life. It should be measured by various thresholds using money and physical resources as measurement tools.
In order to come up with a proper way of measurement, it's important to look at the past and current ways poverty is measured, to evaluate and figure out how to improve them.
Since the 1960s, an income-based measure known as Official Poverty Measure, or OPM, has been used in America. This threshold is calculated by multiplying the cost of a thrifty food basket. It is calculated this way since in the 1950s, people spent a third of their income on food. This measure is now about 15%. One of the issues with the OPM is fairly obvious. The measure it uses is no longer relevant. One thing the OPM does do correctly is its use of money as the main measurement tool. Money within society is the main tool used to purchase items, and by using money as a measurement, it simplifies the process. The OPM is the least helpful form of measurement, however. This is mainly due to it only looking at the cost of food. The logic behind this choice is sound. If a family spends a third of their income on food, then OPM makes sense. However, this is no longer the case, with food becoming cheaper and now taking up less than a third of income, thereby making the OPM outdated. For reference, here are the OPM numbers throughout the years.
Moving on from the OPM, we have a new form of measurement which the U.S. has recently introduced, the Supplemental Poverty Measure, or SPM. This measure improves upon the OPM in many ways. The most significant of these improvements is a change to how the threshold is chosen, which now includes a median of all household expenditures. The amount of money a family has is also calculated differently than the OPM, taking into account taxes and out-of-pocket medical expenses and adding non-cash benefits such as SNAP. For our approach, income would be measured similarly by taking income after tax, subtracting out-of-pocket unusual expenses, and adding non-cash benefits. However, in addition to this, charitable resources would be added. For example, food banks. This would be added since a family benefits from food banks, it would not have to spend as much on food. It could channel resources that would go to food elsewhere. Say you had two people who are the exact same, but person A has access to a food bank and person B does not. Person A could theoretically use these resources to go take night classes or purchase an amenity to increase their quality of life. Instead of just accounting for medical out-of-pocket expenses, we would adjust this to unusual out-of-pocket expense. By changing the language behind these other expenses, which may not be picked up in the thresholds, would be picked up. Say someone has to pay for a speeding ticket. This impacts their income and the resources they have to pay for necessities.
Thirdly, we have the capabilities approach. This approach addresses the idea of capabilities and functions. Capabilities are the ability to do something, while function is actually doing that something. A popular example used is riding a bike. Having the capability to ride a bike would involve whether or not you have access to one, you can physically ride a bike, it is socially acceptable to ride a bike, and there are safe roads to ride on. Meanwhile, having the function of riding a bike would be literally riding the bike. Taking into account capabilities is critical to truly assessing the situation people are in.
The capabilities approach does a very good job addressing the true needs of a community and impoverished people. For example, you could have an infinite amount of money, but if you live in a food desert, then you would not have the capability to buy food. What we propose would be a variation of this approach. By focusing on capabilities, you can see the true potential of resources someone has access to. With solely focusing on income or function, you miss a major part of the story. Going back to the bikes, say two people have bikes and both can ride them. They would be seen as equal. But for one person, their society bans the use of bikes, so their bike is essentially worthless. It is important to take into account all resources a person has access to, so that measures to address poverty can be used as effectively as possible.
This form would provide varying thresholds to account for the differing experiences an impoverished group may experience. All the measures we have talked about adjust for the number of people in the family/living in the home. However, they do not account for other expenses some people may have more of than others. For example, someone who has diabetes needs insulin to survive. This would cause this person's cost of medical care to be higher. The threshold will be raised for this person as they need more money to account for their needs. Or, sanitation products for women versus men. Women need sanitation products, but yet this cost is not counted for them. In this case, the threshold will be raised for women rather than men.
The most common complaint with the capabilities approach and approaches similar to it, such as ours, is, how would this work? It seems almost impossible. However, if you truly think about it, it's not. Take the capability to read. Simply check literacy rates or middle school passing rates. For medical care, you can look at longevity and morbidity rates. These rates will show us how long people will truly live and the quality of life they may have. We would use a system to create the threshold for every individual person. Ideally, this system would account for every situation a person may be in. The main issue would be deciding what would count for the system and what would not. For example, should a bill for cable count toward the threshold?
Now let's look at how this measurement approach would work with an example. Take person A and person B. Assume everything between them is the same, excluding the factors we will be discussing. Also assume all factors will cost the same. Person A has 2 children they must care for, so child care would be added to the threshold, increasing their threshold by X amount. Now, person B is paying for night classes, which would now add to their threshold. On top of night classes, person B lives in an apartment where they must pay a housing and internet bill. This would be added to the threshold. Now, person A has diabetes, has to commute to work, and is pregnant and takes prenatal care. All these costs are added and make person A's threshold to be increased to higher than person B. Person A and person B can make the same income, but person A could be considered impoverished and person B not. As shown, this approach is fairly versatile and can take into account a multitude of factors that can be left out with other approaches. As mentioned earlier, the major tool used to measure poverty will be money. This is due to the fact that in the majority of the world, money is used as a tool for exchange to get the necessary resources. For example, food, water, electricity, and housing. Poverty is a far-reaching concept that definitely cannot be defined by just money. But for the purposes of measuring, money is the best option, as it is the most globalized form of measurement.
The goal of our measurement style is for it to be as versatile and adaptable for every person in the world. It could be adjusted for every currency and inflation per region. It would take into account the costs of goods within the area it's measuring. Anyone whose post-tax income plus cash and charitable benefits minus unusual out-of-pocket expenses falls below the threshold would be considered impoverished. This approach would fluctuate per person.
There's one major counter-argument to this approach. Quality of life is different for every region. How would the thresholds be chosen for different regions? Cost of owning a car and buying gas would be accounted for someone who commutes to work. But for someone who may not need a car to be capable in society, the cost of a car would not be added to their threshold.
A part of this can be found in Rector's argument. His argument highlights how modern-day poverty in the United States is far better off than poverty seen in other parts of the world. For example, 99.7% of Americans who were deemed to be in poverty in 2005 owned a refrigerator. This point was fairly interesting and put different perspectives into play. But this point fails to point out how impoverished people within the United States lack many advantages and opportunities that people who are not impoverished do have. This argument fails to show the disadvantages impoverished people have that are not just tangible. Our approach would work to fix this fallacy. As mentioned earlier, there is more to poverty than the physical, tangible aspects. For example, by lacking nicer clothes, a person may be embarrassed to go out in public or go to church, fearing social consequences. It is important to address these social issues as they impact the capabilities of every person.
To conclude, we propose a very idyllic way of measuring poverty, and acknowledge that this approach would be fairly difficult to implement. However, in an ideal world, this approach would give the best measure of poverty. It shows what people truly have access to live a dignified life.
Thank you.